Genghis Khan's own soldiers killed everyone who witnessed his burial, then erased the path home. No map, no marker, no living memory ever survived. 800 years later, geneticists studying ordinary medieval graves in Kazakhstan weren't even looking for him, they were tracing his son instead. What they found written directly into ancient bone still narrows one of history's oldest unsolved mysteries. The man who vanished, Genghis Khan, was born sometime around 1162, though even his birth year is debated among historians who rely on conflicting sources written well after his death. He grew up in a hard, unstable world of rival Mongol clans, survived years of poverty and betrayal as a young man, and eventually clawed his way to power by uniting those same rival clans under his own rule. By 1206, he had been declared Genghis Khan, a title generally translated as universal ruler, and he spent the next 2 decades expanding his territory in almost every direction. By the time he died in August 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China all the way to the edge of Europe. It remains, even today, the largest connected land empire in human history, larger than the territory ever held by Rome or Alexander the Great. His grandson Kublai Khan would later push the borders even further, but the foundation for that reach was laid entirely by Genghis Khan himself in a single generation. The exact cause of his death is still not settled science. Different historical sources describe different endings, ranging from a fall from his horse to a sudden fever to wounds received in battle. What almost every source agrees on is the setting, a military campaign against the Western Xia dynasty in what is now northern China, far from the Mongolian homeland where he had grown up. His body was carried back to that homeland for burial, and this is where the mystery really begins, because from this point forward, historical sources stop agreeing on almost everything. A grave built to disappear. According to legend, Genghis Khan asked to be buried without any markings, stone, or structure of any kind, just an unmarked patch of earth, indistinguishable from the surrounding steppe within a single season. The stories describing what happened next read almost like a horror movie, and they have been repeated so many times that many people now assume they are settled fact rather than legend. Soldiers killing everyone along the burial route, gravediggers killed by a second group who then killed themselves, 1,000 horses trampling the ground flat, even a claim that a river was diverted to bury him in the exposed riverbed before the water was let back in. Historian Jack Weatherford, who has spent years studying Genghis Khan and Mongol history in depth, has been blunt about these stories, stating plainly that none of the more dramatic legends, including the mass killings and the diverted river, are backed by any actual historical evidence. What most serious historians agree on instead is something far simpler, that the lack of surviving records was very likely intentional, meant to protect the grave from enemies and preserve the spiritual privacy of the burial, rather than to hide some elaborate murder conspiracy. Even the writers closest to Genghis Khan's own family seem to have been kept in the dark. The Secret History of the Mongols, one of the oldest surviving Mongol texts, records the year of his death but includes no details at all about where he was actually laid to rest, and not even his own grandson Kublai Khan is believed to have known the exact location. Decades after the burial, one of history's most famous travelers passed through the region, trying to get real answers, and even he came back with nothing solid. The traveler who couldn't find it either. Marco Polo passed through Mongol territory in the late 1200s, only about 50 years after Genghis Khan's death, close enough in time that people who had personally known members of the burial party could theoretically still have been alive. Even with that relatively short gap, Polo could not pin down the burial location with any real confidence, though he did record that every great Khan descended from Genghis Khan's line was carried for burial to a mountain region called Altai, a detail that lines up with one specific place that keeps showing up across nearly every serious modern investigation. That place is Burkhan Khaldun, a mountain in the Khentai range of northeastern Mongolia. According to the Secret History of the Mongols, Genghis Khan personally declared this mountain sacred during his own lifetime, took refuge there during a dangerous and formative moment early in his rise to power, and is recorded as having declared it his favorite place afterward, with some accounts describing him expressing a direct wish to be buried there when his time eventually came. Before we move further into this, if you're finding this interesting, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. For centuries, that connection was treated as strong circumstantial evidence, but circumstantial evidence is not the same thing as proof. In 2004, a joint Japanese and Mongolian expedition uncovered the remains of what is believed to be Genghis Khan's palace nearby, in Mongolia's Khentai province, a real breakthrough that reignited speculation about a nearby tomb, but no burial chamber, coffin, or grave marker connected to Genghis Khan personally has ever turned up near the palace site, even after repeated follow-up surveys. The lawyer who found 60 tombs, but not the right one, Maury Kravitz, was a Chicago commodities trader and lawyer who became so consumed by the search for Genghis Khan's tomb that he reportedly spent close to 4 decades and a significant portion of his personal fortune chasing it. He organized what became known as the Genghis Khan Geo-Historical Expedition, working alongside University of Chicago history professor John Woods, along with a team of Mongolian academics. In the summer of 2004, Kravitz announced a major find at a press conference held at the University of Chicago. His team had located a walled burial ground, encircled by a 2-mile stone wall standing as high as 12 feet in some areas, near the town of Bat Sharit, roughly 200 miles northeast of the Mongolian capital. Inside that walled complex, they identified at least 60 unopened tombs sitting undisturbed beneath the surface. Kravitz was careful to make clear that none of the 60 tombs had actually been excavated, telling reporters plainly, "We don't know, we have not excavated," so nobody could say with any certainty whether Genghis Khan himself was buried among them. Kravitz's project drew real controversy, with some Mongolian officials and members of the public expressing unease about a foreign-led team digging so close to land considered sacred. Kravitz continued pursuing the search for years afterward and passed away in 2013, having never confirmed the actual tomb, though the 60 tombs his team located remain a documented, genuine archaeological find in their own right. Understanding why so much of this region remains untouched requires looking at one of the strangest and most effective conservation efforts in world history, the Forbidden Zone. Nobody was allowed to enter. The area believed to contain Genghis Khan's actual burial site sits within a region historically known as Ik Korig, which translates roughly to the Great Forbidden Area. For centuries, entry into this zone was strictly prohibited to ordinary people, with hunting, logging, mining, farming, and even building roads or temples all banned inside its boundaries, first enforced by imperial guards under later Mongol rulers, and eventually protected under Mongolia's modern government and military structure. That level of protection eventually caught the attention of an international body that had nothing to do with treasure hunting at all. On July 4, 2015, UNESCO officially added the site to its World Heritage List under the title Great Burkhan Khaldun Mountain and its surrounding sacred landscape, covering an enormous protected area of more than 443,000 hectares. UNESCO recognized the site both for its centuries-old tradition of mountain worship and for its direct connection to the secret history of the Mongols, which mentions the mountain by name more than 24 times. That combination of centuries-old taboo and modern international protection created an unusual problem for anyone hoping to find the tomb using traditional digging methods. If Genghis Khan really is buried somewhere on this mountain, the very same forces protecting the land from destruction are also the reason nobody can simply walk in with a shovel. That contradiction is exactly what pushed one modern researcher to try solving the mystery without disturbing a single inch of ground, searching from space instead of underground. Dr. Albert U. Min Lin, a research scientist affiliated with the University of California, San Diego, approached the problem from a completely different angle, starting around 2008. Rather than digging, his team proposed searching using satellites, drones, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and electromagnetic induction, tools capable of examining the ground in detail without ever breaking it open, a project eventually named the Valley of the Khans Project. The project's most unusual move came in 2010, when Lin's team opened the search up to the general public. Through a partnership connected to the National Geographic Society, ordinary volunteers anywhere in the world could log on to a dedicated website, view extremely high-resolution satellite images of the Mongolian landscape, and flag anything that looked unusual against the natural terrain. The results were documented in a peer-reviewed paper published in PLOS One in December 2014. Over 10,000 online volunteers contributed more than 30,000 combined hours of image analysis, covering roughly 6,000 square kilometers of terrain and generating over 2 million individual feature tags. The search did produce real, verifiable results, just not the one everyone secretly hoped for. Lin's team identified dozens of confirmed archaeological sites in the region and thousands of individual artifacts, including roof tiles, charred wood fragments, and horse teeth, dating to roughly the time of Genghis Khan's death, along with what appeared to be a large earthen mound and a separate structure Lin has personally described as resembling a shrine, though he has been careful never to claim either one as a confirmed grave. While all of this was happening in the mountains of Mongolia, a completely separate line of research was quietly chasing an entirely different kind of evidence, written inside the DNA of millions of living men instead of buried underground. The Duna question nobody could answer. Since nobody has ever recovered a confirmed body, tooth, or bone belonging to Genghis Khan himself, scientists cannot run a direct genetic test against his own remains. Instead, one of the most talked about genetic studies connected to him worked backward, starting with living people instead of ancient remains. In 2003, an international team of geneticists published a study analyzing the Y chromosome, the piece of genetic material passed down almost unchanged from father to son across generations, and found one particular lineage showing up at unusually high frequency across a huge stretch of Asia, roughly matching the borders of the old Mongol Empire. Based on the pattern, the researchers estimated that around 16 million living men, or about 0.5% of all men on Earth at the time, likely carried this same lineage, most plausibly traced back to Genghis Khan and his direct male descendants, given historical records describing him and his sons fathering large numbers of children across the empire. Later reporting, including coverage from National Geographic, noted that nearly 8% of men living within the historical borders of the old Mongol Empire carry this nearly identical Y chromosome pattern even today. There is one important catch responsible researchers have always been upfront about. Because scientists have never actually recovered confirmed DNA from Genghis Khan's own remains, this connection is built entirely on statistical inference rather than direct genetic proof. That specific gap, a genetic signal strongly suggesting a connection without any confirmed body to test it against, is exactly what a brand new 2026 study finally started to close. Not by finding Genghis Khan himself, but by finding something almost as valuable: the new discovery in Kazakhstan. In early 2026, researcher Aykin Askapuli and colleagues published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzing ancient DNA recovered from 4 tombs in the Ulitau region of central Kazakhstan, an area steeped in historical legend and long associated with the Mongol Empire. The genetic analysis, which researchers on the team compared to a forensic investigation, found that the Y chromosomes of several individuals buried there belonged to a specific branch of what geneticists call the C3 cluster, a genetic marker suggesting a possible direct connection to the ruling lineage of the Mongol Empire. That specific region carries real historical weight tied directly to Genghis Khan's own family. Medieval chronicles written by the Turkic scholar Jamal al-Karshi describe Jochi, the eldest son of Genghis Khan and the first ruler of the Golden Horde, dying during a hunting expedition in the mountains of Ulitau, and a structure known today as the Jochi Mausoleum still stands in the region. Researchers involved in the new study explained that identifying Jochi's actual burial place could help historians narrow the search for the tomb of his father, since Jochi died before Genghis Khan, and the two men's burial traditions and general resting regions were likely connected through the same family and cultural practices. The findings still require additional confirmation, and researchers have been careful to describe this as a promising new direction rather than a finished discovery. Understanding exactly why Jochi's story matters this much to the wider search means looking closely at who he actually was within Genghis Khan's own family. Why Jochi matters so much. Jochi was Genghis Khan's eldest son, born under circumstances that created lasting tension within the family, since his mother had briefly been held captive by a rival clan around the time of his conception, leading some in the Mongol court to question his parentage throughout his life, despite Genghis Khan publicly treating him as a legitimate son and heir. Jochi went on to command major military campaigns for his father and eventually received control over the westernmost portion of the growing Mongol Empire, territory that would later develop into the Golden Horde, one of the most powerful successor states to emerge after the empire's founder died. Jochi died before his own father, sometime around 1225, meaning any confirmed burial site connected to him would represent one of the earliest and most historically significant Mongol royal graves anywhere in the world, predating Genghis Khan's own death by roughly 2 years. That timing and family connection is exactly why a real, confirmed genetic link between the newly studied Kazakhstan remains, and Jochi specifically, would carry such significant weight for researchers still hunting for his father's tomb, since the two burials would likely share cultural, geographic, and genealogical threads a purely speculative search could never establish on its own. That kind of concrete, testable genetic thread, rather than another round of legend or another satellite scan of empty steppe, represents a genuinely different category of evidence than almost everything that has come before it in this 800-year search. Understanding exactly what the new genetic markers can and cannot actually prove requires looking closely at the specific limits researchers themselves have placed on their own findings. What the genetic markers actually showed the C3Y chromosome cluster identified in the Ulitau remains is the same broad genetic family researchers have long associated with the wider Mongol ruling class, including the lineage tied to the original 2003 study estimating millions of living descendants across Asia. Finding this specific marker inside tombs located in a region medieval chronicles directly connect to Yochi's death gives researchers a genuinely meaningful overlap between physical genetic evidence and written historical record, exactly the kind of cross-confirmation that has been largely missing from this search for centuries. That said, a shared broad genetic marker is not automatically the same thing as definitively identifying one specific individual's remains. The same 2026 research team that made this discovery had already published earlier work in 2025 studying separate medieval remains from the Golden Horde, finding that the Y chromosome pattern, long associated with Genghis Khan, likely reflects contributions from several powerful, related lineages within the Mongol ruling class, rather than tracing back cleanly to one single patriarch alone. That earlier finding means even a strong genetic match inside the Yulitao tombs still needs considerably more specific confirmation before researchers could responsibly claim they had identified Jochi himself, rather than simply another high-ranking member of the same broad ruling family sharing a similar genetic background. That careful, honest limitation is exactly the kind of caution that separates real, credible science from an overhyped headline, and it explains precisely why every serious report covering this 2026 discovery describes it as a promising new lead rather than a solved mystery. Even with that caution built in, the specific, geographically grounded nature of this new genetic evidence still represents a genuinely different category of progress than almost anything the search for Genghis Khan's own tomb has produced in decades. Why this still isn't the same as finding Genghis Khan's own tomb? It is worth being completely clear about exactly what has, and has not, actually happened here. Researchers have not found Genghis Khan's body, his coffin, or any confirmed grave marker bearing his name. What they have found is a set of medieval tombs in Kazakhstan carrying a genetic signature connected to the broader Mongol ruling family, sitting in a region medieval written sources already tied to the death of his eldest son specifically. If further testing eventually confirms these remains genuinely do belong to Yochi or his immediate circle, that confirmation would still only narrow the search for his father's own tomb rather than end it outright, since Genghis Khan's own burial almost certainly happened in a completely separate location, most likely somewhere near Burkhan Khaldun in Mongolia rather than in Kazakhstan at all. The real value of this discovery lies in demonstrating that modern genetic science can meaningfully connect specific medieval remains back to specific named historical figures using real, testable evidence, a capability that simply did not exist during any of the earlier searches described throughout this story. That distinction matters enormously for setting realistic expectations about where this research actually stands today. Genuine, incremental scientific progress rarely arrives as one single dramatic breakthrough solving every remaining question at once, and this latest Kazakhstan discovery fits that same honest, careful pattern rather than the more dramatic framing a viral headline might prefer. A completely separate, long-standing theory about where the actual tomb might be located points to an entirely different country altogether, and it deserves its own honest look before reaching any final conclusion. The other theory, China instead of Mongolia. Not every serious researcher agrees the tomb sits somewhere in Mongolia at all. Alan Nichols, president of the Explorers Club, has spent years mapping out an alternate hypothesis, placing Genghis Khan's tomb in the Liupan Mountains of northern China, based on his own reading of historical sources describing the location where Genghis Khan is said to have died from an arrow wound suffered during his final campaign in August 1227. Nichols's theory rests on the argument that a leader dying during an active military campaign deep inside enemy territory might realistically have been buried closer to where he actually died, rather than transported the full distance back to Mongolia under the kind of extreme secrecy later legends describe. That theory remains speculative and has not produced any confirmed physical evidence of its own, standing as one alternate possibility among several competing hypotheses rather than a settled alternative answer. That kind of genuine, ongoing disagreement among serious researchers working from the same limited historical sources but reaching different conclusions about basic geography is itself a useful reminder of just how little confirmed physical evidence actually exists anywhere in this entire 800-year search. Even with a real, published genetic breakthrough now sitting in Kazakhstan, the specific location of Genghis Khan's own resting place remains genuinely unknown, and reasonable, credentialed experts still disagree about which country it might even be in. Why some researchers hope it stays hidden. After nearly 800 years of searching, dozens of expeditions, satellite surveys, ground radar scans, one massive crowdsourcing project involving over 10,000 volunteers, and now a genuine genetic breakthrough tied to his own son, Genghis Khan's tomb, remains exactly where it has always been, unknown. What makes this particular mystery different from most unsolved archaeological questions is that a real discovery might not be treated as pure celebration by everyone involved. Local Mongolian communities and researchers working in the region have expressed genuinely mixed feelings about the search itself, separate from whether it would even succeed in the first place. Some people in Mongolia still view Genghis Khan not just as a historical figure, but as a spiritual one, and see any attempt to dig up his remains as a direct disturbance of something sacred, rather than a scientific victory worth celebrating. There is also a very practical concern sitting underneath the spiritual one, since a tomb this significant would almost certainly contain valuable historical artifacts, and protecting a site like that from looters the moment its exact location became public knowledge represents a genuinely serious ongoing challenge. That tension is a big part of why Albert Lin's entire approach centered on non-invasive technology, and why the new Kazakhstan genetic research, however promising, has been handled with the same careful, methodical caution rather than a rush toward premature announcement. So the search continues, carefully, slowly, and mostly from a respectful distance, narrowed just slightly further than it has ever been narrowed before. Verdict: Genghis Khan died in August 1227 in what is now northern China, and his body was carried home for a deliberately secretive burial. Almost every account agrees the grave was left unmarked on purpose, though the wilder legends about mass killings and diverted rivers were never backed by real evidence, and researchers still generally believe the actual tomb lies near Burkhan Khaldun, the mountain Genghis Khan himself called sacred, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In early 2026, researcher Aykan Askapuli and colleagues published genetic findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, identifying Mongol ruling class Y chromosome markers inside medieval tombs in Kazakhstan's Ulitau region, a location medieval chronicles already connected to the death of Jochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son. That discovery represents a genuinely real, still developing scientific lead, one researchers themselves describe as narrowing the search rather than solving it, since it points toward Jochi's own burial rather than his father's, and still requires further confirmation before anyone can responsibly claim more than that. No tomb belonging to Genghis Khan himself has ever turned up, whether through Kravitz's 60 unopened tombs, Albert Lin's satellite and crowdsourcing project, or any expedition before or since. The mausoleum in Ordos, China, remains a memorial rather than his actual grave. Nearly 800 years later, history's most successful conqueror still rests exactly where his men intended, guarded now by legend, law, heritage status, and a genuinely promising but still unconfirmed genetic trail leading back through his own son. If you found this one interesting, subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next video.